Now, here is something that you might have missed this week, something very important. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has promised to clamp down on radical Islamism. Her party, Brothers of Italy, currently in government, has put forward a bill to tackle what they're calling Islamic separatism across the country. And this is aimed at combating religious radicalisation and religiously motivated hatred. Now, because they're in government, this is expected to pass. And if it does, the following policies will be implemented in Italy. A ban on the burqa and niqab in public places and fines of between £260 and £2,000 if they're worn in shops, offices, schools and universities. Tighter scrutiny of mosque funding and the funding of other Islamic organisations. Criminal penalties for cultural crimes, including virginity testing. Increased punishment for forced marriages, which could lead up to 10 years in prison. Adding religious coercion as grounds for prosecution. Well, I don't know about you, but I think this is exactly the kind of thing that we should be doing here in Britain. This is more essential than ever, of course, in the wake of the hideous Islamist terror attack on a synagogue in Manchester last week, which left 2 innocent people dead and 3 others injured. After driving into worshippers at the gates of the building and launching his stabbing spree, Jihad al-Shami stopped to call 999, reportedly telling the handler, "I have killed 2 Jews in the name of the Islamic State." And we have now learned today, according to the Telegraph, that al-Shami attended a mosque associated with a fundamentalist branch of Islam which inspired ISIS and in which the imam described Jews as, and I quote, treacherous. It is more apparent than ever here in the UK, I think, that we currently have no serious strategy to tackle Islamism at all. Make no mistake, radical violent Islamism presents the greatest single threat. It is responsible for the vast majority of terror deaths and roughly 75% of MI5's current caseload. Islamists are infiltrating and influencing Western institutions, societies and cultures, even long before anybody has launched a terrorist attack. Now, I've written about this in recent days, and I've shared some of my own thoughts as to how we might add to this fight back against radical violent Islamism. I think we need to get a grip on order and control in our prisons, where Islamist extremists are running riot, turning them into recruitment hubs. Officers don't have the backing to confront self-styled emirs, unsupervised worship, and extremist literature. I think we need a new control centre outside the main estate for those ideologically inspired prisoners. I think we also need to give Ofsted proactive powers to investigate extremism, to restore confidence that schools cannot be quietly radicalised under the radar. And we should be monitoring madrasas, tuition centres and weekend schools much more closely than we are currently doing. As the Batley Grammar School case has shown, a teacher still in hiding, by the way, in this country after they happened to offend local Muslims. We need to draw a clear line. There can be no blasphemy codes in state education. There can be no blasphemy laws in this country. Our children must rediscover national pride and learn to challenge malign, ideological and supremacist influences. And I think we need to ensure that mosques cannot operate as unregulated spaces where extremist ideas are normalised. They should be registered and subject to inspection powers similar to schools, required to submit to governance and curriculum oversight. Where repeated extremist rhetoric or incitement is found, regulators must be able to suspend or close them down. And we must stop Islamists from abusing their charitable status as a reputational shield and a funding pipeline by regulating charities to cut off extremist finance and support. And I don't know about you, but Sharia councils should be abolished in this country. We should not have parallel legal systems in this country. As always, though, I want to know what you think about this issue. There are lots of people in Westminster who will not talk about this issue. They want to throw it under the carpet. But as you know, I will always talk about the tough stuff. So reach us at gbnews.com/yoursay or on X @gbnews. But joining me now to discuss this in the studio is Head of Public Policy, a Christian Concern and Islamic Affairs expert, Tim Dieppe. And Tim, I should say at the outset, has written this great book called The Challenge of Islam, Understanding and Responding to Islam's Increasing Influence in the UK. Tim,
thank you.
Giorgia Meloni has really launched quite an ambitious response to Islamism. We should say at the outset, it's important to say, the majority of Muslims firmly disassociate themselves from radical, violent interpretations of Islamism.
Yeah.
But Giorgia Meloni, she's right. Is she to get her arms around this to really push the debate in Europe forward?
Absolutely. I've been arguing for like 9 years plus that we should ban face coverings in public. And it has been done in 20 other countries, including France, Switzerland, Netherlands, Tunisia, and various other countries as well. It can be done. It should be done. I nearly gave up on it in the pandemic where we all had to wear face coverings, but we've come back from that. And they're absolutely right to do it. It's a health risk. It's a security risk. It's a safety risk. It's a barrier to communication. It dehumanises women, and it creates, statuses women as kind of sexual objects that men can't possibly resist, and that kind of thing. So yes, we should ban face coverings in public places completely. I agree with that.
What about, let me just say, there are people out there who would say, actually, the sign of a liberal society is allowing people to do whatever they want, to wear whatever they want, and to affiliate with whatever religious doctrine they want to affiliate with.
There are limits to that. Polygamy is another limit, for example. We shouldn't be allowing polygamous marriages, and there are lots of, probably tens of thousands of polygamous marriages under the radar in this country. We found that Jihad al-Shami has got 3 wives, for example. We shouldn't be allowing this. One way to stop this would be to say all religious marriages should be registered. If you force religious marriages to be registered, you put a stop to polygamy. Step one, that's one big win. And another thing you do is all these women, there are thousands and thousands of them who've got unregistered marriages. They'd have no legal rights if their husband divorces them or leaves them or dies. And Islamic divorce is just, I divorce you 3 times. So we need to give these women legal protection by saying these marriages should be registered in law, and then they have protection. Furthermore, 95% of Sharia council business is dealing with divorces, Islamic divorces, because they don't have their rights because it's an unregistered marriage. You would cut down, smash their business completely if you registered all these religious marriages and said it's got to be registered in law.
What about this argument, as we've seen in the papers today, the evidence that the Manchester terrorist had fallen under the influence of preachers in local mosques who had been saying some pretty unsavoury stuff about Jews, not in Israel and elsewhere. What can practically be done in that sphere of mosque scrutiny, of finding out what's going on, of coming down on people who are preaching or essentially are inciting violence and terrorism in our country?
Well, incitement to violence is already a crime, isn't it? So we just need to apply the laws that we have today and tell people this is not acceptable, and arrest people if necessary and prosecute them if necessary if they're inciting violence.
So, for example, one thing I think we could be doing is really reshaping the Charity Commission and having much greater oversight of charitable foundations, charitable organisations, using that as one way to try and clamp down on extremist financing and support.
Where there's extremism in the sense of anything to do with inciting violence or anti-Semitism, of that kind of thing and so on, it absolutely should be clamped down. It absolutely should lose their charitable status for anything like that.
Let me just push you a little bit further, because there's one thing Giorgia Meloni hasn't mentioned, but President Trump has, which is banning future migration from predominantly Islamic nations. Where are you on that?
We need to absolutely clamp down on immigration. And there is a difference here between Islamic immigration and other immigration. We've had no problems with Ukrainian, Hong Kong, South Korean, Nigerian, no problems integrating all those people. They become great citizens. The problem we have is Islam, where it comes and it wants to create Sharia councils, a parallel legal system. It wants to have Sharia finance in our systems. We want to have Islamophobia law, Islamophobia code to prohibit free speech in relation to its own religion and this kind of thing. We don't get this with other areas. We don't get this with other communities and other groups. We get it with Islam. Trevor Phillips, the former head of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, said in 2016 in an article in the Sunday Times, we've integrated all these people, but the challenge of integrating Muslims will be the greatest challenge this country has ever faced. He said that in 2016. Right, 9 years ago. It's not got any easier since then. It's only got harder. What's happened in the country has only proven that he was right to say that.
Well, Tim, stay with us. I'm just going to bring in our panel, acting deputy comment editor of The Telegraph, Poppy Coburn, and political commentator Kai Wilshaw. Kai, lots of people on the right of Europe at the moment. I was in Paris and Strasbourg this week talking with lots of politicians, speaking in the European Parliament. They're all now saying this is really the big challenge that is facing Europe, that unless they get their arms around this issue of Islamism, or the Islamification, as they see it, of Western nations, we may not actually have nations as we currently recognise them in the decades to come.
Yeah, and let's be clear, that's fear-mongering. And yes, in the extreme example, and there are many extreme examples being targeted correctly by Giorgia Meloni, and perhaps we should be looking at that in the UK. But apart from those extreme examples, as you yourself said in one of your opening questions, there are vast swathes of Muslims in this country who abide by British laws and actually go about their days completely compatibly with British culture. Now, conflating Muslim culture and the culture of those who come here from Muslim countries with some of those dangerous practices that you outlined is a classic way of trying to demonize so many Muslims across this country as being extreme, as being violent, and using this terrorist attack as a pretext to introduce all these laws is ridiculous, frankly.
But you do recognise there is a problem with Islamism, right? And
yes, I do.
It's
I do, but as we know,
you're much more likely to commit a terror attack than you would be if you're an atheist.
But to take the portion of people using the niqab and the burqa as an example, that was one of the sort of the headline of the Telegraph article that we're talking about here in relation to the Maloney laws. That's 3,000 to 5,000 people in the UK, perhaps. Of course, we see them much more in London because there's a much larger Muslim community here. Yeah. But to make such a huge issue out of this, when actually that isn't the vast.
Just one second, Kai. Poppy Coburn, what's your view? Is Maloney overstepped here, or is she in mood with the zeitgeist?
I always find it interesting when people invoke that we are a liberal society when anyone attempts to clamp down on incompatible parts of cultures that actually can be quite repressive. Because multiculturalism has already eroded a lot of things that people liked about liberal society. For example, we now have hate speech laws. That was something that was introduced because people were concerned about community tensions. And that concern over community tensions was considered more important than our ancient right of free speech. So it's always a trade-off.
That's such an Americanism. We've never had.
Where do you think they got free speech right? Anyway, look. The point I'm trying to make here is that obviously walking around in a niqab is making a statement. I don't just think it's a religious thing. I think it's making a statement, which is I am different and I want to live my life differently here and I don't care for the customs of this country. Now, I'm sorry, that is a problem, and it would be a problem if it's coming from any group that was foreign to the UK. Just because we're focusing on Islam is because it's the one that's most visible to people.
Tim did mention a list of countries at the outset that have banned the burqa and or the niqab. What's been the reaction in those countries to that move? I assume governments had no real problem doing it. Has there been a sort of backlash against it? Have Muslims protested and organised? I mean, what would likely happen here if we were to do that?
I mean, I think France did it many years ago, right? So, they did it way ahead of us. And now you've got Italy. It'd be interesting to see what the reaction will be in Italy. Other countries have done it as well without any significant backlash that I've seen so far. So I think this is achievable. As he said, it's a minority of Muslims that do this anyway. So not all Muslims are campaigning saying, I want all my women to wear face coverings and so on. So I think it's quite achievable to do this.
Kai, you say it's just a small number, but actually, firstly, I was in parts of London, as you say, last week, and I probably saw more than the number you mentioned of people wearing burqas and niqabs. And I think there is an issue around integration. I mean, this is a week where we've had a very robust national debate over integration. Are we an integrated society? Now, when I go to some towns in England, and I do see lots of people wearing burqas and niqabs, or I see visible signs of segregation, I'm concerned. I mean, it makes me worried about the future direction of travel here.
Yes, I agree, but the conversation is never around integration and never around policy solutions for integration.
Well,
and always around these headlines, always around these headline issues. One of the reasons there hasn't been a backlash in places like Switzerland, for instance, is the number of people wearing a niqab or a burqa is in the double figures.
Well, France has a very large Muslim population, and they've banned it.
Yes, but the point I'm trying to make is this is such a non-issue in the majority, in the vast majority of this country, and actually, yes, we do need to make sure that any community isn't ghettoised in certain areas. We are seeing that here in the UK. But let's introduce incentives for people to actually move to other schools, all that kind of thing.
For how long do you think it would be a non-issue? For example, if you were to be massively increasing immigration from Muslim countries, that makes integration, which is a slow and difficult to measure process, much more difficult. I mean, there's also a factor that we haven't really discussed yet, which is that sometimes people choose to wear what would appear to be a religious covering, not out of particular religious feeling, but as a way of expressing, cultural difference. You will see many women who wear a hijab who are actually not particularly religiously Muslim. They're doing so because they want to express that they are somehow different from the mainstream.
They choose.
The debate will carry on as always.